This is Duke University.
Tentatively, this research suggests that multiple political economic factors, ecological conditions, and structural associations between nations or societies all to some extent influence society-nature relationships. So now turning a bit to the ecological footprint of nations, I'm going to assume that many, if not all of you, are kind of familiar with the footprint, at least conceptually. Maybe some of you have used it in the classroom. You've had your students go online and calculate their footprint and realize that there would need to be like 8 worlds if everyone consumed as much stuff as they do. It's a very useful tool pedagogically, and it's really quite eye-opening. But here we're analyzing the per capita footprints of nations, where specifically these data quantify the amount of biologically productive land required to support the consumption of renewable natural resources and assimilation of CO2, waste products of a given population, in this context per person, because we're looking at per capita footprints. A little bit more specifically, these measurements include the amount of cropland, grassland, and pasture, forest area, the bioproductive area required to absorb CO2 released when fuels are burned, and the area required for built infrastructure. What's unique about these measurements, though, is they're actually reported in global hectares or area units. And if you've ever looked at the calculations involved by those that come up with these data, which I'll talk about in a minute, the Global Footprint Network folks, they're rather complicated, and I could spend 2 or 3 hours talking about the methodology, and I can't, but I'll say a few things to sort of give you an idea of the logic behind it. The general idea is consumption or consumption-based environmental demand equals production plus imports minus exports for a whole bunch of stuff. More than 600 products, primary resources as well as manufactured goods that are derived from them. The Global Footprint Networks folks obtain data from the FAO stat and the UN Comtrade data sets where flows of goods are reported in weight. So they're able to obtain these data in weight rather than by value, by their economic value. A couple of important things to keep in mind too, in these sorts of calculations, a variety of equivalence factors and yield factors are used to deal with differences in world average productivity among land types, or to account national differences in biological productivity as well. And they're also quite careful to make sure that they're not double counting, dealing with issues such as secondary ecological functions that are accommodated on the same space as primary functions. Okay, I'm already getting into a lot of nitty-gritty, but more generally, though, and this is an important point, on the one hand, this is a rather comprehensive measure. On the other hand, it doesn't include everything. But this sort of simplified map shows that in general, nations that tend to be in the global north that are more affluent have higher per capita footprints, but tend to have lower levels of deforestation within their borders. Many of them actually have experienced rates of reforestation or afforestation. Conversely, then, kind of in the global south, you see lesser developed countries, primarily in the global south, tend to have lower per capita footprints, yet higher rates of deforestation within their borders. Thus, this kind of resource consumption, environmental degradation paradox. Now, later in my theoretical discussion, I'll talk explicitly about ecologically unequal exchange theory that argues within sociology that these sorts of inverse relationships are sort of two sides, to some extent, of the same coin, dealing with unequal exchanges between more affluent and less affluent societies in the contemporary world economy. The majority of what we're reporting are fixed effects models. We use random effects models where we have time invariant predictors, like climate, and I'll get to that in a minute, and a few others. All of our models include unreported period-specific intercepts. We analyze a pretty large, according to us, pretty large unbalanced panel data set, 2 to 10 observations from 1960 to 2003, at those 5-year increments, and then in 2003 for 69 nations, developed and less developed countries. Our sample sizes vary because we want to maximize the availability of data. So our sample sizes vary greatly from 156 to 534 observations. Some of the really small ones are because we restrict some of our models just to less developed countries, as you'll see. And then our final set of analyses are restricted currently to the 1975 to 2000 period, but we're working on resolving that temporal limitation. Our dependent variable is the per capita footprint that we obtain from the Global Footprint Network. I'm happy to share these data, by the way, if anyone's interested for whatever reason. It's a huge time series data set. It's quite interesting. There's a lot of opportunities, I think, for a lot of dissertation or thesis projects with these data. The majority of our independent variables are obtained from the World Bank or the World Resources Institute. Level of development, again, constant US dollars. All of our measures that are logged are done so to minimize skewness. Arable land per capita. This is our measure of urbanization. Again, it's quite limited, but this is pretty consistent with what's usually used, at least in comparative sociology, but we acknowledge it's quite limited. This is our military measure that we're currently using, and what we're reporting here, military expenditures, is percent GDP. We control for manufacturing and services, even though I didn't explicitly talk about it within that kind of rough around the edges working draft. We do a great deal. There's a lot of pragmatic reasons and theoretical reasons why we should control for the manufacturing and services sectors. Indeed, this is not what I expected to find. I expected to find perhaps some evidence of relative decoupling in developed countries. And we're seeing the same pattern here. This really surprises us. And again, methodologically, when things surprise you that much, are you doing something wrong? Are you doing something wrong? For less developed countries, we're not as surprised, because different theories that are often at odds with one another might predict this. Whether they're more critical perspectives or traditional modernization perspectives, that we're not seeing any evidence of relative decoupling in this context in lesser developed countries. The way that we split this, these are those in we arrange it in income quartiles. So the upper income quartile, the bottom 3 income quartiles. We really would love to get your thoughts about this, because we really want to try to figure out how to rigorously and fairly assess this decoupling debate. This is one of the biggest issues in environmental sociology. We think it has serious policy implications. We do think that tentatively, though, what we're seeing so far, this really does sort of back up this argument that we're making about a serious need, at least within sociology, environmental sociology, for much more theoretically inclusive and methodologically rigorous comparative research on environmental sociology, and this is something that we're trying to do.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.